November 10, 1918, Belleau Wood, France. 05:47 hours. The morning fog clung to the shattered tree stumps like burial shrouds, and through that gray veil came a sound that would haunt German soldiers for a generation, the deep-throated battle cry of United States Marines advancing through what had once been a forest but was now a hellscape of splintered wood and cratered earth. Oberleutnant Klaus Hoffmann pressed himself against the cold stone of his machine gun nest, his hands trembling, not from the November cold, but from something else entirely, something he had not experienced in 4 years of war on the Western Front. The smell of cordite mixed with the acrid stench of gas residue and the sweet rot of death that permeated every trench and shell hole in the sector. But what commanded Hoffmann's attention was not the familiar odors of industrial warfare, but rather the rhythmic cadence of boots striking earth in unison, the mechanical precision of an advance that suggested these Americans approaching through the fog were something different from the doughboys German forces had been fighting since spring. The sound grew louder, not the chaotic rush of attacking infantry, but rather the measured pace of men who advanced because they had been ordered to advance and who would not stop advancing until they had taken their objective or died trying. Hoffmann had fought Russians on the Eastern Front, had faced French colonial troops at Verdun, had exchanged fire with British regulars at Passchendaele, but he had never encountered soldiers who combined the discipline of Prussian guards with an aggressive ferocity that seemed almost personal, as if each American Marine took German resistance as a personal affront, requiring immediate and overwhelming response. The fog began to lift as the sun rose behind the American lines, and through the dissipating mist Hoffmann could see them now. Marines advancing in small unit formations, each man covering his fellow, leapfrogging from crater to crater, with tactical competence that suggested professional training combined with combat experience that these Americans should not have possessed, after fewer than 6 months in sustained combat. The symbolic sound that would come to represent American Marine Corps combat effectiveness was not the dramatic explosion of artillery or the staccato of machine gun fire, but rather the steady, relentless cadence of the M1 1903 Springfield rifle, the distinctive crack of the .30-06 cartridge being fired by Marines who had been trained to shoot with accuracy that approached the legendary marksmanship of German Jaeger units, combined with an aggressive mindset that emphasized closing with the enemy and destroying him through superior will and firepower at close range. Each rifle crack announced not just a round fired, but a Marine who had identified a target and engaged with the confidence of someone who expected his shot to hit, who had been trained to standards that emphasized marksmanship as a fundamental warrior skill, and who viewed his rifle not as a tool for suppressing enemy positions, but as a weapon for destroying individual enemy soldiers through precisely aimed fire that German troops found psychologically unsettling, because it suggested a level of individual competence that contradicted German assumptions about American military capability. This moment, German soldiers encountering United States Marines in sustained combat for the first time, would establish patterns of perception and response that would persist through 2 world wars and beyond. The German military, which prided itself on tactical excellence, operational competence, and warrior culture, refined through centuries of military tradition, discovered in American Marines an opponent who challenged German assumptions about American military effectiveness, who combined individual initiative with unit cohesion in ways that German doctrine aspired to, but that German forces did not consistently achieve, and who demonstrated a willingness to accept casualties in pursuit of objectives that suggested either extraordinary courage or disturbing indifference to death. German soldiers could never quite decide which interpretation was correct, and this ambiguity contributed to the psychological impact that Marine units had on German forces who faced them in combat. To understand why German soldiers developed such intense respect and hatred for American Marines, one must first comprehend the cultural and institutional context that shaped German perceptions of American military forces more broadly. German military culture in the early 20th century viewed the United States as an economic powerhouse, but a military lightweight, a nation whose wealth and industrial capacity could not compensate for lack of military tradition, professional military establishment, or warrior culture that emphasized duty, honor, and sacrifice as fundamental values. German assessments of American entry into World War I had predicted that American forces would require years to become combat effective, that American soldiers would lack the discipline and training necessary for modern warfare, and that American tactical doctrine, if such existed, would be primitive compared to the sophisticated operational art that German General Staff had refined through decades of theoretical study and practical application. The United States Marine Corps, however, contradicted these expectations in ways that German intelligence and frontline reports struggled to explain within existing frameworks. The Marine Corps was not a mass conscript force like the American Expeditionary Force's infantry divisions, but rather a professional military organization with institutional culture emphasizing individual excellence, unit pride, and aggressive combat doctrine that prioritized taking the fight to the enemy rather than defending positions or conducting the methodical, limited objective attacks that characterized much of Western Front warfare. Marines were volunteers who had chosen military service, who had survived training regimens designed to weed out those who lacked physical or mental toughness, and who viewed themselves as elite warriors rather than as citizen soldiers fulfilling civic duty. This institutional identity created unit cohesion and fighting spirit that German forces recognized as comparable to their own elite formations. The Marines' arrival at Belleau Wood in June 1918 came at a moment when German forces were conducting their final major offensive of the war, attempting to break through Allied lines before American reinforcements could decisively shift the strategic balance. German intelligence had tracked American unit movements and had noted the presence of Marine brigades attached to Army divisions, but intelligence assessments had not adequately conveyed what encountering these formations in combat would actually mean for German infantry who faced them. The initial contact between German forces and Marines occurred during German advances through the Belleau Wood sector, when Marine units were ordered to stop the German advance and established defensive positions that German forces attacked with the tactical confidence born of 4 years of combat experience and recent offensive successes. The first German attacks on Marine positions at Belleau Wood were conducted according to standard infiltration tactics, small units probing for weaknesses, attempting to outflank strong points, using terrain for concealment, and covered approaches. What German infantry encountered was not the expected resistance, hasty defense by inexperienced American troops who would break under sustained pressure, but rather precisely aimed rifle fire from Marines who had been trained to shoot from distances of 500 yards and beyond, who engaged German infantry at ranges where most World War I soldiers fired blindly in the general direction of the enemy, and who inflicted casualties at rates that forced German units to break off attacks and reassess their tactical approaches. German after-action reports from these initial engagements noted with surprise that American Marines demonstrated marksmanship comparable to specialized German sniper units, that Marine defensive positions were organized with tactical competence suggesting professional training, and that Marine morale appeared high despite the intensity of German artillery preparation and infantry assault. The German hatred of fighting Marines, and hatred is not too strong a word to describe the emotion that German soldiers expressed in letters, diaries, and post-war accounts, derived not from simple fear of competent opponents, but rather from a more complex mixture of frustration, respect, and psychological dissonance. German soldiers had been conditioned by military culture and propaganda to view themselves as superior warriors, members of a military tradition that produced the world's finest soldiers through rigorous training, iron discipline, and warrior ethos that elevated military service to the highest expression of manhood and national identity. Encountering American Marines who matched or exceeded German infantry in tactical competence, who demonstrated equal or greater aggressive spirit, and who seemed to take German military prowess as a challenge rather than as a deterrent, created cognitive dissonance that German soldiers found profoundly unsettling. The tactical methods that Marines employed amplified this psychological impact. Marine doctrine emphasized offensive action even in defensive situations, with counterattacks launched to retake lost positions, raids conducted to keep German forces off balance, and aggressive patrolling designed to dominate no man's land and gather intelligence about German dispositions. These tactics meant that German forces facing Marines could never rest, could never assume that holding a position for a day meant it would be held the next day, and could never settle into the routine of trench warfare that had characterized much of the Western Front's static periods. The Marines' aggressive posture forced German units to maintain higher states of readiness, to commit more resources to defending sectors where Marines operated, and to accept that combat against Marines would be continuous and exhausting rather than episodic and manageable. The sound of the Springfield rifle became for German soldiers a symbol of Marine combat effectiveness and a source of psychological stress that affected unit cohesion and individual morale. The distinctive crack of the .30-06 round was not louder or more mechanically impressive than other rifle cartridges, but its meaning, the knowledge that each shot was likely aimed rather than random, that a Marine rifleman who fired was likely to hit what he aimed at, that taking cover was insufficient protection. If a Marine had identified your position, created psychological pressure that accumulated across days and weeks of sustained combat. German soldiers learned to distinguish the sound of Marine rifle fire from the more general noise of infantry combat, learned to recognize when Marines rather than regular Army infantry were in the line opposite them, and this knowledge affected tactical decisions in ways that German officers noted with concern because it suggested that their infantry were losing confidence in their own superiority. The Battle of Belleau Wood itself became a defining moment in how German forces perceived American Marines and how Marines understood their own institutional identity. The battle lasted from June 1st to June 26, 1918, and consisted of repeated Marine attacks through densely wooded terrain that favored defenders against German positions that had been prepared and fortified, conducted under conditions where German artillery and machine guns commanded clear fields of fire across the approaches Marines had to traverse. German forces expected to repel these attacks with relative ease. The tactical situation favored defense, German forces were experienced and well-equipped, and American forces were attempting frontal assaults against prepared positions under conditions where such attacks had consistently failed throughout 4 years of Western Front warfare. The Marines attacked anyway. They took casualties that would have broken most units, approximately 50% casualties in the brigade that conducted the main assaults, but they continued attacking until German positions were overrun, until German defenders were killed or captured, until the objective of clearing Belleau Wood of German forces was achieved. German soldiers who survived these attacks reported being shocked not just by Marine tactical competence, but by their apparent indifference to casualties, their willingness to continue advancing despite losses that should have caused unit cohesion to collapse, and their refusal to break even when tactical situations suggested that breaking would be the rational response. German reports used words like fanatical and suicidal to describe Marine attacks, terms that revealed German inability to comprehend how American forces could sustain such losses and continue functioning as effective combat units. The Marine Corps' institutional response to Belleau Wood, celebrating the battle as a defining moment in Corps history, emphasizing the casualties as evidence of warrior spirit rather than as tactical failures, incorporating "retreat hell," reportedly said by a Marine officer when French forces suggested withdrawal, into Corps mythology, demonstrated a cultural orientation toward combat that was fundamentally different from how European forces understood warfare. European military tradition, including German, accepted that infantry would break under sufficient pressure, that casualties beyond a certain threshold would render units ineffective regardless of leadership or morale, and that tactical withdrawals were sometimes necessary to preserve combat power for future operations. Marine culture rejected these assumptions, emphasizing instead that Marines never retreated, that casualties were acceptable if objectives were achieved, and that unit integrity was maintained through shared identity as Marines rather than through preservation of physical strength. German soldiers who fought Marines at Belleau Wood and in subsequent engagements developed a hatred that was inseparable from respect. They hated fighting Marines because Marines were genuinely dangerous opponents who inflicted casualties through tactical competence. They hated the psychological pressure that Marine aggressiveness created, and they hated that Marines challenged German assumptions about military superiority in ways that threatened German soldiers' understanding of themselves as elite warriors. But this hatred was combined with respect, because German military culture valued martial excellence above almost all other qualities, and Marines demonstrated martial excellence in ways that German soldiers could recognize and appreciate even as they struggled against it. The German nickname for Marines, Teufelhunden, devil dogs, reflected this ambivalent mixture of hatred and respect. The origins of the term are disputed, but it appears in German documents and accounts from 1918 and was adopted by Marines themselves as a point of pride. The name suggested that Germans viewed Marines as somehow inhuman, as warriors who fought with ferocity that exceeded normal human limits. And this dehumanization was both a compliment to Marine combat effectiveness and a psychological defense mechanism that allowed German soldiers to rationalize why fighting Marines was more difficult than fighting other American forces. If Marines were devil dogs rather than ordinary men, then German soldiers' struggles against them did not reflect poorly on German capabilities, but rather reflected the exceptional nature of the opponent. The symbolic significance of the Springfield rifle, that recurring sound of aimed fire from Marine positions, extended beyond its immediate tactical effects to represent American military culture's emphasis on individual marksmanship as a fundamental military skill. German military training emphasized collective discipline and coordinated action, with individual soldiers trained to function as components of larger tactical units whose effectiveness derived from organization rather than from individual excellence. Marine training emphasized both collective discipline and individual excellence, with every Marine expected to be a rifleman, first regardless of his specific military occupation specialty, and with marksmanship training that made every Marine a potential sniper, rather than just a component of massed infantry. This philosophical difference in training priorities reflected broader cultural differences between German and American approaches to military organization and combat effectiveness. World War II would provide additional evidence of German attitudes toward American Marines when the two forces met in combat again, though this time primarily in the Pacific, where Marines conducted amphibious operations against Japanese forces. But there were instances in the European theater where Marines served in security details or in liaison roles, and German intelligence officers who encountered Marine prisoners or who debriefed German prisoners who had fought American forces invariably asked whether Marines had been present in the opposing formations. German respect for Marines had survived the interwar period and was transmitted to a new generation of German soldiers through institutional memory and through accounts from veterans who had fought at Belleau Wood. This continuity of German perception across two wars suggests that the impression Marines made on German forces was profound and lasting, that it was based on consistent, observable behaviors rather than on propaganda or mythology, and that it reflected genuine advantages that Marine Corps training and culture provided in combat situations. The transformation in German perception of American military effectiveness that resulted from encountering Marines in World War I had strategic implications that extended beyond tactical adjustments on the Western Front. German intelligence assessments after 1918 increasingly recognized that American military potential could not be dismissed, that American forces could achieve combat effectiveness more rapidly than European military traditions suggested was possible, and that American industrial capacity combined with military effectiveness created a potential threat that Germany would need to account for in any future conflict. These assessments were not always heeded by German political and military leadership in the interwar period, but they represented institutional learning that recognized American Marines as evidence that American military capability exceeded what German pre-war assumptions had predicted. The post-war German military literature that analyzed American combat performance devoted disproportionate attention to Marine operations, attempting to understand how American forces that lacked centuries of military tradition had produced formations that could match German elite units in combat effectiveness. German analysts identified several factors that contributed to Marine effectiveness. The volunteer nature of Marine recruitment, which meant Marines had chosen military service rather than been conscripted. The intense training that emphasized physical conditioning and combat skills. The institutional culture that emphasized aggressive spirit and refusal to accept defeat. And the tactical doctrine that prioritized taking the initiative and maintaining offensive momentum even in defensive situations. These factors were recognized as replicable advantages that any military organization could potentially adopt. But German analysts also noted that these advantages emerged from American cultural and institutional contexts that were difficult to replicate in societies organized according to different principles. The hatred that German soldiers expressed toward fighting Marines was ultimately hatred of an opponent who challenged German military identity and self-conception in ways that were psychologically threatening. German soldiers could rationalize losses against numerically superior opponents, could accept defeats when outnumbered or outgunned, and could maintain morale by attributing setbacks to material disadvantages rather than to qualitative deficiencies. But Marines challenged German soldiers on their own terms, matching or exceeding German infantry in individual and unit effectiveness, demonstrating aggressive spirit that equaled German warrior ethos and achieving tactical success through methods that German military culture valued and claimed to exemplify. This challenge to German military superiority was more threatening than simple battlefield defeat because it suggested that German assumptions about martial excellence and warrior culture were not unique, that American society could produce warriors who matched German soldiers in the qualities that German culture most valued. The sound of the Springfield rifle, that recurring acoustic symbol of Marine combat effectiveness, was ultimately the sound of American military culture announcing itself as legitimate and effective, of individual American Marines proving through combat performance that democratic societies could produce professional warriors who matched authoritarian military establishments in effectiveness, and of American institutional capacity to create military organizations that combined modern training methods with traditional warrior values in ways that produced genuinely elite combat formations. Each crack of a Springfield fired by a Marine was a small refutation of German assumptions about American military inferiority, and the accumulation of those small refutations across thousands of engagements at Belleau Wood and elsewhere created a comprehensive demonstration that American military power was not just a function of industrial capacity, but also of institutional competence and individual excellence that German forces had to acknowledge even as they struggled to defeat it. The epilogue of the German-Marine relationship is that the hatred German soldiers expressed was the hatred of recognition that Marines represented military excellence that German culture claimed to monopolize, recognition that American society could produce warriors comparable to German elite formations, and recognition that the democratic values that German ideology dismissed as weakness could coexist with combat effectiveness that German military traditions respected. The Marines who advanced through the fog at Belleau Wood in 1918, whose Springfield rifles cracked with precision as they engaged German positions, who accepted appalling casualties and continued attacking until their objectives were taken, forced German soldiers to confront the possibility that their own military supremacy was not as absolute as they had believed, that American forces could match German combat effectiveness when properly trained and led, and that the war's outcome might be determined not just by material advantages, but by the reality that American military institutions could produce warriors who were at minimum the equals of German infantry in the qualities that mattered most in combat. The sound of the Springfield would eventually be replaced by the M1 Garand, by the crack of modern rifles in conflicts beyond World War I, but the lesson that sound had taught remained relevant across generations, that military effectiveness derives not just from tradition or culture, but from systematic training, aggressive leadership, and institutional values that emphasize individual excellence within collective discipline. The Germans hated fighting American Marines above all others because Marines embodied a truth that German military culture found threatening, that democratic societies committed to individual liberty could produce warriors who matched or exceeded authoritarian societies' military elite, that freedom and martial excellence were not contradictory, but could reinforce each other, and that the future belonged not to those who claimed inherent superiority, but to those who combined traditional warrior values with modern institutional competence and with political values that empowered individuals while demanding collective sacrifice in service of larger purposes. The hatred was recognition, the respect was acknowledgement, and both together testified to the effectiveness of an institution that had challenged German military supremacy and proven through combat that American Marines were in fact warriors whom German soldiers had reason to hate fighting above all others.